potential bias that he asked me to return. But that's a question for him.
But he kept everyone else.
Sir, I don't know the staffing decisions that were made by Director Mueller after I departed.
Including 13 Democrats.
Sir, I don't know the affiliation of the people on his team.
So, but he was concerned enough about your text to remove you, but you never felt concerned enough to remove yourself.
That's correct.
Mr. Strzok, you're going to get asked other questions here that relate to your transition from the investigation of Ms. Clinton into the beginnings of this investigation into the Trump campaign and the alleged collusion with the Russian government. Now, Mr. Strzok, the FBI is a creation of this body. Congress created the FBI with its constitutional authority. Today, you are here under subpoena. I know you've come voluntarily in your opinion, but you're also under subpoena. Also, an exercise of Congress's constitutional authority. Which takes precedence, FBI policy or the United States Constitution?
Sir, always the United States Constitution. My understanding is I am not here under subpoena, that I am here voluntarily. I understand a subpoena was issued for my prior closed interview, but not for the this session today.
A subpoena was issued and service of which was accepted.
That's not my understanding, sir.
In a Supreme Court case handed down just last year, the court reviewed whether statements made by a juror that indicated racial bias required the piercing of jury deliberations. Justice Kennedy wrote, the opinion of the court holding that racial bias exhibited by a juror provided an exception to the rule that jury deliberations must remain confidential because it is necessary, quote, to ensure that our legal system remains capable of coming ever closer to the promise of equal treatment under the law that is so central to a functioning democracy. On several occasions, you have referenced that all the texts in the questions were simply personal opinions exchanged with a close confidant and in no way reflected your intent to act on your opinions. Yet, if you made these statements while on a jury, it is hard to imagine that you would not be kicked off immediately because of the risk that your bias would undermine a functioning democracy. Do you still hold that personal opinions, even in the face of Supreme Court precedent, should not have tainted your involvement on any investigation relating to Secretary Clinton or President Trump?
Mr. Chairman, I think you're mixing apples and oranges. I'm not an attorney, and I'm not familiar with that Supreme Court ruling. But based on what you said, protected categories, things like race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, are protected matters that we may not, the government and by law, people may not be discriminated against based on their role one way or the other in any one of those categories. That is entirely separate and distinct from political belief or political opinion. That, on the other hand, is encouraged, is protected by the First Amendment. And this body, under the Hatch Act, my understanding is, sat and said and recognized—
No one stopped you from sending the text, Mr. Strzok, but the special counsel, Mr. Mueller, removed you from the investigation when he saw the texts.
That's true, sir, he did. Now, if I may go back to answering your question, if I may. In terms of political speech, that is radically different from any sort of protected category of race, gender, and ethnicity or other categories. Political speech, political thought is protected. The courts have recognized, the Constitution recognizes, we all have political belief. And so when it comes to the expression of that political belief, that is something that this body, under the Hatch Act, enumerated kind of the categories of what was prohibited, and then expressly stated that if it is not prohibited, then it is expressly encouraged. So I would tell you that no one in here, it's an impossible definition to say people must not have political opinion. Everyone does. Of course they do. The test is whether or not that is left behind when you're doing your job. To your question of whether or not I would express that in front of a jury, of course I wouldn't. That would be inappropriate. As to your question of whether each and every one of those jurors, when they go home and they're sitting in their backyard with a friend, has a political opinion, my answer would be undoubtedly, almost if not all of those jurors would.
But they're instructed when they leave the jury panel each day to not communicate with anyone regarding the matter that they are considering. So that is a very different thing. You were considering a matter and you were conducting texts of a very biased, salacious manner that was totally inappropriate. And when Mr. Mueller saw that, he removed you.
Sir, I appreciate that concern. But what I'm telling you is there is a vast difference in my mind between an action as a juror being instructed by a judge not to discuss the matters of a trial compared to a citizen of the United States.
You don't suppose there's a reason why
and discussing his personal
You don't suppose there's a
opinion.
reason why that instruction made? So the chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you. Let me begin by congratulating the witness on his completely correct statement of key First Amendment law, that people are entitled to political opinions. Now, you, sir, obviously expressed your political opinions as to Mr. Trump and Hillary Clinton and various others in text messages to Lisa Page.
I did.
And she to you.
Yes.
And these were private political opinions.
Yes.
Which you did not express publicly.
Correct.
And the Inspector General found, with respect to the investigation to Hillary, quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practices." That is correct, that is the finding of the IG, no?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And with respect to the Russia investigation, the IG said that that he was disturbed by the appearance that investigative decisions might be impacted by bias, but made no such findings, and in fact hadn't completed his investigation of the Russia investigation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, when people talk about the appearance, whether people on this panel or the Inspector General, the appearance of bias created by those text messages might create the appearance of bias only if they're public. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Because otherwise there'd be no appearance.
That's correct.
And they were not intended to be public, were they?
Correct.
They were communications between two private individuals,
True.
which are totally permitted.
That's correct.
Now, are FBI agents permitted to have political opinions?
Yes.
And as a 22-year veteran of the FBI, could you tell us, without naming names, were you familiar with the fact with other FBI personnel having political opinions with respect to the presidential campaign?
I was.
And were some of these people anti-Trump?
They were.
And were some of these people pro-Trump?
Yes.
Thank you. And to your knowledge, did any of the pro-Trump bias or the anti-Trump bias in personal opinions affect the